Hi again. This is in the series of the South African conflict, and it's really just my thoughts on Southern Africa in general, particularly in light of the books I've reviewed and some of the issues that people um, may think significant and may have questions about. Um, I've been to Southern Africa well over 30 times and sometimes quite extended stays. I'm no means an expert on the place, but these are just some of my views. A lot of people tend to lump Rhodesia and South Africa together. They were very, very different countries. I found Rhodesia to be a delightful place. It was a very polite society. Young people stood up when adults came in the room. The way of life was very good, was high level of education and so on. I never saw any racism there. I didn't hear people use racist language. And really, they were in many ways the success story of Africa at a time. And when the issue of independence came up, what the Rhodesians didn't want was what had happened in their neighbouring countries and the rest of Africa. There have been some quite graphic examples when Rhodesia, northern and southern Rhodesia was one country. Refugees, white refugees from the Congo streamed over the border, the northern border, and with horrific tales of butchery and rape. So the example was rather graphic to them, what they wanted to avoid. So when the famous winds of change sweeping through Africa, as Macmillan said, the Rhodesians came under pressure, and the Council of Tribal Chiefs actually supported Ian Smith's government, the Rhodesian Front, and appealed directly to London to allow the country as it was to become independent. And Harold Wilson's Labour government, which was influenced by the Organisation of African Unity and some of the Commonwealth countries, wouldn't allow it. So they declared UDI in 1965, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And the Bush War that emerged was two terrorist groups who were communist backed. They had communist ideology. They had a communist. They were espousing communist systems. One from Korea and one from basically East Germany and Russia, and they were very much wanted Rhodesia to become a communist state, and of course the Rhodesians didn't want this, and the Bush War erupted. And it's amazing that the major Western countries actually back these communist terrorist organizations. I was in Rhodesia in '76 when Ian Smith came on the television and announced that Kissinger had put pressure on Forster in South Africa, and so the South Africans were putting pressure on Rhodesia, and they were going to stop the vital supplies, and the Rhodesian military was down to first line ammo. So Ian Smith had to capitulate and enter some negotiations. However, what happened was Kissinger went to Geneva and started negotiating with the communist groups and threw his hands up. He said, "You just can't deal with these people." So the Rhodesians had a reprieve for some time, and the South African aid continued. The campaign was relentless. There was fake news. Western news organizations took photographs of black office workers dozing in Cecil Park on their lunch break, and said it was a massacre, that they'd been murdered by the white security forces. There were a lot of Africans, a lot of blacks serving in the Rhodesian security force, Rhodesian African Rifles, for example, and there were also coloured units. And these guys were volunteers. It was only the whites that were subject to a call-up. The blacks were all volunteers, and they voluntarily fought alongside the white guys. So in the 1979 election over here, Margaret Thatcher, one of her policies was she was going to recognise Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. The country had evolved a system where they were going to share power with Sitole and Muzorewa, and that was one of the planks of her manifesto, and I actually voted for her. Become the Commonwealth Conference, Carrington and members of the Commonwealth behind the scenes put pressure on Margaret Thatcher, and so she reneged, and big surprise for a politician, and the Lancaster House ensued. Now the worst outcome would have been the election in Mugabe. Everyone agreed, all the Western nations agreed that was the worst desirable outcome, and that's exactly what happened. The country ended up with Mugabe. There were certain plans to take the country back, operations Hectic and Quartz, but the order never came, and General Walls was neutralised somehow by the British government. So Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. It was plunged into what we know now, and Rhodesia had always stood by us. During World War II, they introduced conscription in Rhodesia to call up the men to fight alongside Great Britain. And the reason they had to introduce a call-up was because so many had volunteered that they wouldn't have been left with anyone to run the country. So they instituted a call-up in order to moderate how many were sent to fight. And you know, it's well known Ian Smith was a fighter pilot in the RAF, and we completely turned our back on them. Okay, so that's Rhodesia. South Africa, as I say, is a completely different story. And my first visit to South Africa was 1975, and when I went there, there was a chap called Leon Pantanovitz, who was a black belt from the karate organization I belonged to, and he had emigrated to Israel. He was Jewish, and he'd emigrated sometime before, and he'd come back with one of his students who was going for his black belt. And Leon very, very kindly took me round, showed me a lot of the Cape area, but also told me about the history and about the society. And it was kind of, he gave me an inside-outside view of it. He explained the racial differences. You had the Africans, who are the black population, the coloureds, who were a mixed race and also descendants of the original inhabitants of the Cape area, and the Europeans, the three major racial groups, and how the laws were set up and so on. And he pointed out some things like one of the coloured townships was Stinkwater, which means stinking water. He said, why would you put people in a place called that? You know, it was a total lack of any kind of understanding and human sympathy. And so I learned a lot from that. And also one of the bright things was that the martial arts and karate in particular were kind of the path for racial equality in South Africa, or one of them in a small way. When the Japanese first went over there to teach, the nationalist government was very alarmed and banned further visits. So the South Africans had to go to Japan, and they trained up over there, and they became the highest graded Westerners. But just the nature of sports and the nature of martial arts training, where you all train together, you know, there was that's one of the ways that you break down barriers and you get to know people. And one of the chaps I was training with, Eddie, he was coloured, and I was invited to loads of places, and Eddie said to me, he said, I'd love to take you to dinner. He said, but we can't eat together in a restaurant. It was against the law at the time. And he said, but what I'd like to do is invite you to my house. So I was delighted, and he lived in what had been District 6 up on the slopes of Table Mountain. And it was really a pleasant area. All the houses were pastel shades, and I had a very, very nice meal with his family. And I was told, and he told me, that when they were on training trips, sometimes the white guys would go into a restaurant or a rest stop, a snack bar, and ask if it was all right to bring the non-whites in, and quite often the guys would say yeah, and they would all eat together, even though it was against the law. So at the time the government had a department. It was called the Department for Bantu Affairs, and that was to deal with the Africans. And this was under the system that was called apartheid. And then they found out that Bantu doesn't really mean what they thought it meant. It just actually means people. So they changed the title, and they came up with the amazing title of the Department for Plural Affairs. So it was just mind-boggling. So apartheid was the political system, really. It was a political and a legal system. Excuse me. And what it did, it actually codified racism. Now, there's racism in lots of places, and we're told that the UK is a highly racist place today. But when you've seen it in action at the height of apartheid, and it's actually government policy, then you realise really what racism is. And the idea was they could never have a democratic election in South Africa because the black population outnumbered the whites by a large factor. So what they did, they created notional homelands, Transkei, Ciskei, Bophuthatswana, and so on, where the African population lived, and they were supposed to vote there. No, you're not a resident of South Africa, you're a resident of Transkei. So they had no voting rights in South Africa. That was one thing. And then on top of that, they had the Group Areas Act, which meant that they were only allowed to be in certain places. So if you worked in the centre of Joburg, for example, you had a pass which allowed you to be there, or in one of the suburbs, for example. But otherwise, you had to stay in the townships, which surround all the urban areas. There's Soweto, Guguletu, places like that, Tembisa, all those places. So that was apartheid, and they also had you know, other laws where you couldn't have sexual relations between races and so on. So that was the system. That was apartheid, and obviously everyone could see that it was wrong. The South Africans didn't really have an argument when they were talking about the rest of the world, like Rhodesia, which did have a system that they could defend. So the books that I've reviewed have been mainly to do with the military, the Recce Commando, for example, and those guys were engaged in fighting a terrorist war, mainly on the borders, but there was also an urban aspect to it. And make no mistake, it was terrorism. The Limpert mine attacks in the cities, Umkhonto terrorist organisation, machine gunning people in churches and so on, bomb attacks. It was terrorism by any definition. So that's what those books were about. They were people fighting terrorism as they saw it. Were they working for the apartheid government? Yes, they were. But that was the country they were born in. They've gone into that military and they're defending the country against what they saw as outside aggression. Okay, in 94, F.W. de Klerk became state president, and he immediately, his first address to Parliament, started making revisions. He said he would change the laws and also start negotiating with the ANC. And he took steps to release Nelson Mandela from prison, which led to the 94 election and Nelson Mandela becoming state president. Now, Nelson Mandela was an extraordinary man, and really the world needed more leaders like him. He was inspirational. He was succeeded by Thabo Mbeki, who I think tried his best, but after Mbeki, really the descent began, and South Africa really started to go into a morass of corruption. For example, the corruption is rife, and also cronyism. So, for example, all the chiefs of the South African police since '94 have been arrested for corruption. On the advice of the Western governments, the South African government set up an anti-corruption unit within the not the police but the prosecuting agency, and it was called the Directorate of Special Operations, and usually known as the Scorpions, and that was to fight corruption. The chief of the Scorpions was arrested for corruption. It's a totally corrupt system, it's a totally corrupt country, and the economy is just tanking, disease is rife, and it is really joining the rest of Africa in a slide into darkness. And really, I think replacing the vile apartheid regime with one that is just corrupt is ridiculous. Just one example, just a newspaper story while I was there. A pistol or a set of firearms, it could have been an AK, registered to the ANC, the government party, was used in a bank robbery, was recovered in a bank robbery. Now imagine if that had been the Democratic Party in the United States, for example, or any other Western democracy. It would have been an outrage. It's just a small piece of a news story over there. At the height of apartheid, you had the thing where there was mass immigration into South Africa from the neighbouring countries. People would come over the Limpopo, they would cross crocodile-infested rivers, come through the Lion Park, the Kruger, to get into South Africa and to live in a cardboard box under apartheid in the squatter camps, or informal settlements as they're called. So that kind of tells you what the surrounding countries were like at the time. And unfortunately, the ANC has sent South Africa in that direction rather than towards more of a Western democracy and more of an enlightened time. And of course, the victims are the ordinary people, mainly the black people, the Africans. They are the ones who are suffering, both up in Zimbabwe and also in South Africa. And they're no better off. You know, the health, the well-being, and the finances. They're not getting enough to eat, and so on. It's deplorable. And the final point I'll make is that there's the epidemic of the farm murders, which copying the model in Zimbabwe, it's even worse in South Africa. And I'll link to a documentary on it. And it's tragic, and it's brutal, and it shouldn't be happening in any country that aspires to be part of the community of nations. So that's kind of my take on South Africa. I've got a lot of friends in South Africa from all races, and I've had some great times over there. I've thoroughly enjoyed my visits. I got a lot from there. It's a fantastic place, and this video is titled "I Speak of Africa." I would recommend you look up the poem by Theodore Roosevelt, it's at the start of African game trails, and it's really inspirational.